I'm not sure if this is very encouraging for Ameen, but nevertheless, Ameen is our last speaker of the day. Ameen is a lawyer and policy professional presently working as a data governance lead with CABI International. And Ameen's talk today will focus on the role of participatory practices in the AI lifecycle, which is something we've also heard about in various discussions since the morning. I now invite Ameen to present his talk.
Yeah, thanks, Simran. I think you mentioned earlier, towards the end of the second panel, that there are two novel proposals today around how we can build responsible AI within ecosystems. But I think, to be fair, participatory approaches are not a novel conversation. Like literally today in the panels before, there's been a lot of attribution to contextualizing research, contextualizing AI to local regions and local realities, talking about how different ecosystems need to involve communities and, on the ground, like having an ear on the ground to just mitigate the risks of AI and make them more regionally viable. So just on that, good afternoon. I'm not gonna reintroduce myself. Thanks to Simran for that. Given that it's a 10-minute lightning talk, I'll delve quickly into an area that has been part of my research work for the last 3 to 4 years now. So I do work on different aspects of responsible AI, and participatory approaches are particularly a focus area that I worked with IIT Madras and their Center for Responsible AI in my last role and in my previous organization over parts of 2022 and all of 2023. And we came out with a two-part report. So the first bit was mostly around theoretical frameworks of participatory approaches, and the second bit was around actually recognizing it and trying to operationalize it in two use cases. The first was around use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement, and the second one was around the use of health advisory tools and predictive tools like oncology prediction and oncology advisory. So those are like some specific use cases that are available in the second report. Both the reports are accessible on CRI and my previous organization, 𝗣𝗿𝗍𝗄𝗍 Center for Legal Policy's website. So if anybody's curiosity is piqued after this session, please go back and take a look at those documents. They're quite well researched, in my opinion. So yeah, can we go to the first slide? Yeah. Just to quickly give an overview. So I think the whole notion has again, there was a lot of talk around this. The idea, the core sort of premise behind participatory AI is to basically recast the power dynamic between designers, developers, deployers, end users, and more importantly, something that Sundar also flagged out, indirectly affected people who may be part of your vulnerable population. So that is, the core concept is basically that there is a power inequity between these different stakeholders, and some of them have a more predominant voice on the AI table when you are negotiating governance, when you're talking about how the technology even has to be designed and developed. And participatory approaches try to sort of bring in a more balanced approach and try to make the table more equitable. Now, in its, so I'll briefly take you through some core aspects of theorization, again, more detail in the papers that we've published. I'll also allude to some of the benefits and challenges and try to link them up to the two predominant portions of the life cycle that we've looked at, which is your design and development phase, and then your deployment and post-deployment assessment and adoption phase. So we can just go to the next slide. Yeah. So in terms of theorizing, I think there are different sort of terminologies that have been utilized when people talk about participatory approaches. The most common one is probably just stakeholder engagement. It evolves, the idea of participatory approaches to AI is again a derivative of your larger understanding of participatory governance. We have seen aspects of participatory governance even in India in different kinds of laws. You have your labor laws where the notion of collective bargaining is essentially a representation or a manifestation of participatory approaches. You have your land acquisition laws where you are again looking at how local communities, gram panchayats need to be involved in decisions around if a land is to be acquired, what is the just remuneration, and how will rehabilitation for those communities work? Similarly, when we talk about AI, the idea is that you are going to bring in some of these largely or in theory competing interests to the same table and try to diminish the gaps between them. So we've already heard a lot around, like, there are like the panel that was talking about aligning multiple stakeholders. I think there was a point made on how internationally we are in a bipolar world, where there is your supposedly liberty-oriented Western democratic principles versus your ideas of more authoritarian usage of the state and its machinery, including the use of AI. But that sort of dichotomy or those kind of fault lines definitely exist in any kind of ecosystem, even if you come down to at your local and regional level. And participatory approach is basically a sort of bridge to overcome some of those differences. And in the theorization, I do want to flag, sorry, can we just go to the next slide if anybody's controlling the slides? But anyway, a commonly sort of, in my opinion, a misnomer that gets conflated with participatory approaches is the democratization of AI. And in my opinion, democratization of AI and the way it sort of appears in a lot of literature that purports to be participatory AI or purports to be around participatory AI, it's more about gaining more access and more market space or disseminating or penetrating your AI systems across a larger landscape rather than actually fixing the inequalities in power dynamics between different stakeholders to develop an ecosystem that is more responsible and safer in its design, development, deployment, and adoption of AI systems. So just wanted to flag that is something, again, like we've delved a lot at that distinction between why democratization of AI is sometimes just like a smoking gun that gets co-opted particularly by a lot of AI developers to say that, we are trying to improve access. And again, like, I'll just circle back to something that has already been covered. We've talked a lot around, I think it was, again, in the second fireside chat where when Sameer was mentioning about digital health, he said that, they don't even ask doctors or people who are practicing in the health system, do you need the technology? Now, that is, doctors are still, like, I would say, in one sense, a very privileged strata within that ecosystem, but end users will never get consulted. Do you want this kind of a technology? So in the name of democratization or improving access, technology is just funneled into the ecosystem without actually recognizing its positive or negative fallouts in adopting that same thing. So yeah, I also just mentioned something like the Einstein ladder is, if there are any people from a social policy background, they would probably recognize that instantly, but it's a general theoretical framework for understanding participatory governance in general, but also very much applicable to when you talk about participatory AI. It talks about non-participation, tokenistic participation, and actual meaningful engagement of your citizenry. So as like 3 tiers, and within that there are different pedestals. So again, like, those are realities to any kind of participatory governance and are equally applicable to participatory AI approaches. If we go to the next slide, I can actually talk a bit more around the benefits and challenges. One more, sorry, already covered this. Yeah, so broadly speaking, I think, like, again, like, I'll try to tie in some of these benefits and challenges into the life cycle steps that we've built in our participatory approach. But broadly speaking, in terms of benefits, the main thing is that you are empowering citizenry, not just in terms of like tokenistically saying that, okay, we had like a workshop and we brought in some representatives and asked them to discuss their viewpoints, but meaningful engagement would actually aim to empower them in the decision-making process. So again, going back to that digital health piece, asking doctors and taking their inputs on whether this technology is worthwhile, that, clearly 40% is of your capital is going into diagnostic technology. Is that an output that actually moves the needle forward in improving health services? Or is that something that seems like a low-hanging fruit to the tech developer and the investor, and therefore that just gets pushed forward? that engagement needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be empowering for your citizenry or for your local community, wherever you are deploying or considering deploying an AI system. The second element is around ensuring critical feedback. I think this was also just in the fireside chat that you mentioned, where you're talking about feedback loops and the importance they have. But alongside feedback loops, I think, at least again from from a rights perspective, it's equally important to also have elements of some sort of redressal framework, which is probably more in terms of if there are complaints, are there solutions available? Because again, as a lawyer, and I think Arya was also mentioning this, and this was a point covered earlier, at least in India or even across the globe, there are still very few tangible pieces of legislation that actually empower any end user against the risks, or create a legal liability framework if something goes wrong. So something to be considered in the participatory approaches is that you also have an inbuilt grievance redressal mechanism alongside just normal feedback loops. And on the challenges side, I think one thing that I really want to flag out, which goes back to even Einstein's ladder of participation, is the element of tokenistic or whitewashing of participation, where there are a lot of instances where different stakeholders in power will essentially push the idea or try to push the envelope on participation, but either in the selection of the participants or the actual processes itself, you can critically appraise them and recognize that there are deficiencies, and it is actually not a very inclusive process. So it sort of projects the notion, but in its very existence or in its very implementation is a bit counterproductive. And another aspect is just the co-optation of so where you are bringing in people and you are trying to create a participatory movement or a public people-centric approach to how certain AI systems need to be adopted. A more dominant voice, again, this again goes back to the difference in power dynamics, but a more dominant voice just takes over that discourse and then shapes it in a manner that they want to do. Within the AI space, this is something that I'm pretty sure most people in this room will be familiar with, but there's a lot of discussion from OpenAI and a lot of big tech bros, but also at this point from governments and all who have bought into that same sort of narrative around the long-term existential risks that AI poses. And this is considered to be one of the classic examples of co-optation, where the participatory movement towards making more awareness or generating more awareness around AI risks has been co-opted by people who are investing heavy duty into the perpetuation and furtheration of AI innovation, and are essentially driving regulatory oversight or even those discourses away from recognizing the here and now and the immediate risks of AI, biases and how those can be regulated, and talking about something which is a pure hypothetical, and even within the AI innovation or the scientific community is not a fully, it's not a foregone conclusion that we will reach artificial general intelligence or a singularity. And so this is a classic case of co-optation in terms of where participatory movement agendas can really get steered by your influences, and the more powerful voices within the ecosystem have that ability to sort of overcome or just sort of subsume their agendas into the legitimacy of a participatory movement. Now, yeah, just coming to the last two slides. So in terms of participation in, can we go one slide up? Yeah, in terms of design and development. So again, I think there are three sort of main factors that we looked at when we were considering that how participation can improve certain your overall design and development value. I think so. The first one is around transparency. Having a more having better understanding and employing more than just a technical team or your internal core team into the development stage, whether it is in terms of identifying what kind of data sets need to be added, identifying and validating your initial training models, etc., is a good way to sort of counteract some of the black box and your fragilities in your design itself. Then there is that element of trustworthiness, which is again the fact that the core concept there is that the more open you are, or not open in the sense accessibility wise, but the more visible you are in taking some of these measures towards improving participation and actually meaningfully engaging different stakeholders within your design and development process, it is likely to yield a more trustworthy technology, which in turn helps counter both automation bias to some extent and also promotes the idea of adopting it at scale. This is, again, like I'm not going to belabor those points. Those have been covered to some extent even in previous sessions where they've talked about how trust is directly influential in the scalability of a technology and its adoption. And the last bit, which is more of a challenge, is that at least when you talk about design and development, as inclusive as you may want to be in your participatory approaches, the very nature of those stages is a more expert or technical process. So there is a limitation in one sense that non-experts or like your lay persons may not be a very valuable resource. And sometimes you may want to engage them nonetheless, but that process again can be a bit counterproductive because they may enter, give some information which really doesn't help the model, and in your fairness you want to incorporate it. So it's a bit of a frustrating situation where someone's come and thought that they've made some meaningful inputs into the conversation, but doesn't really actually add value to the design and development. So yeah, that's definitely like a shortcoming around the design and development stage when you're talking about a participatory approach in terms of who can actually be a viable input giver for that stage. And yeah, we can go to the last slide. So this is, again, like this is probably going back to a lot of the discussion that has already happened today. I think there was a question earlier today around like, someone mentioned that there were data centers that, like, when you're talking about AI, you're talking about data storage and data centers, but nobody actually goes and involves those local kind of communities where the data centers have to be placed to understand what is the detriment to those communities. So effectively, selecting your right group of stakeholders in governance and deployment is a crucial way to ensure that you're not on the tokenistic pedestal of the Einstein ladder, but you're actually meaningfully engaging them. And again, there's like 4 sort of key factors that you can look at, which is power, urgency, harm, and legitimacy. They're self-explanatory, and I don't want to go too much into what each of them entails, but the general sort of, at least like the more typical sort of stakeholder engagement will always have power and legitimacy stakeholders, but they won't have so much around harm or urgent stakeholders. And that is something that you, like, if you are considering being more participatory in your understanding towards AI governance, then that is probably, those are the 2 sort of subsets of people or stakeholders that you need to focus on. And then there's, yeah, so the other bit, monitoring evaluation, I've already sort of touched on, that there's a necessity to have feedback loops, but also equally important are your grievance redressal mechanisms. Governance in general is like, that goes back to the ideas of having, like, I think someone mentioned that it is important, like when you're talking about AI governance, that you put yourself in the place of people or consider them. I think in at least like I would say like one of the core messages of our research work was that you don't need to think like that. You need to basically involve them so they can come and give those inputs on how their place feels like and what their impacts are, or what are the kind of impacts that they're going to likely face from the kind of steps that you're doing. And yeah, and the last bit is again around adoption, that if you are able to, like, there is obviously a theoretical ideal type to participatory approach, but the more you can integrate some of these measures into your entire AI lifecycle, the more likely it is that your end result is a robust, more inclusive, and in a label, it's a more responsible AI product that you are putting out. And that in turn is a direct sort of incentive for not only people to invest into, but also people to adopt and use and scale it up at large, at population. So yeah, those are some of the sort of key talking points from the 2 research papers that we've put out. And do we have time for any questions? Otherwise, please ask me outside at lunch.
Yes. Ameen, I request Ameen and Shweta to please come on the stage so that Ankit can felicitate them with a small token of our appreciation. Ankit, please deliver your final vote of thanks.
I think not more than 1 or 2 minutes, right? So thank you everyone for joining us. I think this is one of many interventions Nasscom has done for AI adoption at scale and responsible adoption, right? So we'll continue to do this. This RICON is an yearly affair. We'll do every year, and this and we definitely feel multi-stakeholderism is a backbone of real RAI, right? So I think with that, lunch is there. Please have your lunch, and thank you so much.